All right, well, we'll jump right into this. As Kenneth mentioned, I'm going to be sharing the presentation today with Dr. Brenda Tubana. We talked a little bit, and I think I'm going to give more of the standard recommendations for the whole crop, and then highlighting several areas, and then Brenda will talk about more specific things that she's working on. Starting off, here's a picture of us harvesting sulfur tests with the Rodrigues, and there's the Vacherie water tower in the background. And we had a good season. We had a lot of field trials. We actually harvested over 30 field trials this year, primarily in the Fertility area. So despite the COVID situation, we were able to still collect a lot of good new information. So moving on, I always show this slide because it's useful, and I'll continue to do so. I guess maybe I could change the background to make it a little more interesting. But the point is, these are the priorities, and they really haven't changed. Okay, soil pH is always going to be the most important thing, and our growers know that. They need to correct the pH if it's out of the area, where it needs to be, from 6 to 6.5. After that, nitrogen is very, very important, and probably the single most important nutrient that we put out there. You're going to get more bang for your buck from nitrogen than anything. But we've talked about nitrogen. We've presented a lot of data, so today I'm just going to give the recommendations. Same goes for potassium. Potassium, we've done a lot of research, and for the most part, they've confirmed that our current recommendations are pretty much where they need to be. Sulfur is still actively being researched. I mean, we several years ago, we noticed that sulfur was something that we had neglected perhaps in the research area. We started looking more at it, and we found that, yes, indeed, perhaps we might need to reevaluate the current recommendations and maybe change those. Starter Fertilizer is a project of my own. And this just kind of came up by chance. We added some starter to a trial that we were actually looking at some other adjuvants, and we saw a positive effect. So we started to take a closer look at it, and we've actually seen some positive results with starter at planting. Micronutrients, zinc is the only one we have a current recommendation for. Today I'm going to talk about boron work, though. In the past, we've talked about cobalt. We're still working with cobalt, still has value at planting, but the highlight today will be on boron. And finally, phosphorus is, it's the elephant in the room here. As a good soil scientist, I always think that phosphorus is important, but in all my research and much of Dr. Tubana's too, we really haven't seen phosphorus play an important role, particularly in the spring. At planting, that may be the spot where we need to be putting out phosphorus. So standard slide here for lime. We do it to adjust soil pH to improve fertilizer use efficiency by maximizing nutrient availability. These are the pHs, that we should be using. Looking for 5.8 on a sandy loam and 5.2 on a clay loam. We want to broadcast the fallow fields. You can do it in the fall and winter in standing cane. We've done it. It works fine. Again, target that lime rate to change your pH from 6 to 6.5 based on soil test. And finally, as we said before, pay attention to the quality of the lime, both the CCE, calcium carbonate equivalent, neutralizing ability, and also the particle size. We visited on that, so I won't spend much more time. Current recommendations, no changes from last year or the year before. Plant cane light soils, 60 to 80 pounds. Plant cane heavy soils, 80 to 100. Stubble cane light soils, 80 to 100. And stubble cane heavy soils, 100 to 120. Most of the growers that I've talked to or work with are probably somewhere between this 80 and 120 range. Not too many people that I've talked to are applying more than 120. But then again, not too many folks also are applying less than 80. So for the most part, falling within our current recommendations. As we said in the past, these recommendations take into account data from multiple years and soil types. We have close to 100 experiments now, and they all pretty much support these recommendations. And again, we assume that you fix the pH, and the application date is somewhere between April 1st and 30th. Although, as we said in the past, we're fertilizing by the crop, not the calendar. So that April 1st to 30th can go back can go back into March if we don't get any more freezes, or if we do, it could be pushed even into early May without any major changes. Potassium, this is actually a slide I got from Dr. Ben, but it shows this information pretty well. We're using about 3 pounds of potassium for every ton of cane harvested, and that's what we need to be replacing. And so that's basically, if you look at the rates, that's pretty much what we're doing for the most part. The rates are based on a soil test, and this is one of the two most important things we're getting out of that soil test. One is your potash rate, and the other one is your pH for your alarm requirement. Those are two very important key pieces from your soil test. Potassium is important for water use, might help in drought tolerance, and deficient plants are more prone to certain diseases and more likely to log. Again, talking to most growers, we're probably in this range. Most folks are putting out somewhere between 80 to 100 pounds. And not really paying attention to plant or stubble. But I mean, that seems to be the area. If you haven't applied potash in a long time, we're probably in that very low range, and maybe should consider a greater rate, a higher rate. So moving on, looking at more current research in sulfur. We've been doing a number of trials over the past several years. Most of the varieties that are important right now, the major ones, 299, 540, and 804, Plantain through second ratoon. Whenever we put out one of these tests, we soil sample it before we put out the treatments, and they all test low or medium. The rates go from 0 to 75 pounds. We've looked at a number of different sources. Ammonium thiosulfate, which is probably the most common sulfur source. It's a liquid you can apply your nitrogen with. And the only problem with this material is you are somewhat limited with how much sulfur you can put in there. You try to put too much sulfur, it can affect your nitrogen rate. So you really can't go too much above that 25 to 30 pound range of sulfur with this material. S90, of course, is your actual granular sulfur material. The only downside about this material, it does take some time once it's applied for it to react in the soil to be converted to sulfate, which is the plant available form. A material we're using more in the past several years, ammonium sulfate, another granule material, seems to be easier to use for some folks. And actually, some folks, what they're doing is they're putting 1 aliquid of sulfur as a liquid with ATS and coming back and broadcasting some additional sulfur as ammonium sulfate. Current recommendations are 24 pounds, and that really doesn't change depending on crop age or soil type. And we've spoken in the past how this was done when we were getting the free sulfur from sulfur deposition from the atmosphere. We believe it may be necessary to revise this due to the loss of this atmospheric sulfur. So a bit of a review where we were last year, and there's a reason we're talking about this. This is some data from Rebecca Plantation. Actually, it was done, as I said, last year, and unfortunately we lost this test this past year, and the next one I'm going to show you, we actually lost that one too, unfortunately, and it was just due to the error of when they were applying fertilizer, we didn't get our signals correct, and they actually ended up fertilizing both fields. But we had some very interesting results last year, and we had a significant increase with our higher rate of ATS in this field as far as cane yield. And we're also some trends showing higher yield, cane yield with the 50 and 75 pound rate of ammonium sulfate. Looking at the sugar yield data, again, we see an increase in yield with the higher rate, that 50 pound rate of ATS, and also a similar result with the 50 and 75 pound rate of ammonium sulfate. The other test that we had was with the Robichaux, and again, pretty much wherever we applied sulfur, we increased yields. Um, Again, that 50-pound rate gave us the best results with the ammonium thiosulfate, but look at the excellent response we saw with the ammonium sulfate at both the 50 and 75-pound rate, and it was significant. The sugar data was tremendous. I mean, with the high rates of ammonium sulfate, we're picking up, over 1,500 pounds of sugar, which was quite remarkable. We have never really seen a response like this. And as I said, unfortunately, we lost both of these tests. We're going to replace them this year and go back and try to go back to these same locations and reestablish these. We were able to start another test at Rebecca, and this is in a different location, same setup, 25, 50, 75 pounds of ammonium thiosulfate, 25, 50, 75 pounds of ammonium sulfate. Again, in a similar trend, we see an advantage to putting the sulfur out. In this case, though, our recommended rate of 25 pounds was showing an excellent response. As far as the ammonium thiosulfate material, a little bit better response with the high rate of ammonium sulfate, but it wasn't significant. Now, this is something we've seen in the past, and it's somewhat puzzling. I mean, the effect is a little exaggerated because of the scale here, but we have seen that as we see sometimes with nitrogen, as we increase that sulfur rate, we're seeing a decrease in TRS. We see the same thing with nitrogen. Now, it seems to be a little bit more enhanced actually with ammonium sulfate. Well, this is something we're going to have to keep an eye on. It's not significant, but I mean, these tests all have 6 replications, and it's something definitely we need to keep an eye on. Well, given that effect on TRS, I mean, of course, the effect with that was more significant for ammonium sulfate. You see that moderated the sugar data for these materials. So at the end of the day, that current application rate of 25 pounds seemed to be the best in this particular case. Now, I opened up with a slide from the Rodrigues. I don't have time to show that data, but in that particular experiment, the 25-pound rate seemed to be the better rate over a 3-year experiment. So bottom line is we need to continue research. I think that certainly some of our data on a number of tests has suggested we need to increase the rate, and we're going to continue to look at that. We've had some very good responses to higher rates, but in a couple of experiments, our current application seems to be not far off. So active research is still going to be conducted, and we're going to continue to work on this problem. Bottom line is sulfur is important in any way, shape, or form. So make sure that's part of your plan. So moving on, let's talk about boron. We have several experiments with boron. This is with 299 plantain and second ratoon. Rates went from 0 to 2 pounds. We have one test where it was all foliar. I'm going to start with that. That's a second ratoon test, and then talk about some plantain data where we actually compared foliar and soil applied. And this was all driven, this research, because an increasing number of my soil samples have been found to test low for boron. So we decided to look closer at that. So some data from Keith Dugas, and this is again all foliar applied. Here's our control over here. And you can see we had a marked increase in tonnage with a 1.5 pounds of boron. Not really anything else with the other treatments. However, we did see an increase in TRS with really 3 of the 4 boron treatments. It wasn't significant, but we were picking up, 10 to 12 pounds actually in some of these treatments. And actually looking at the final sugar per acre data, we see that 1.5 pound treatment giving us about 700 pounds of sugar more. So again, last year we had some significant responses. This year it was not significant, but the trend is still there. So moving on to the test we had at Gene Adolph's. This is again boron, and the difference here is on the left, these 3 bars, this is all foliar applied boron, and the right 3 were applied in the soil with the nitrogen. So in this case, we just wanted to know that, applying foliar boron's an extra trip across the field, if we could have the same response by putting it out, with our normal nitrogen application, that would make things way easier. And in this particular case, you see we had the best response to cane yield when we did apply 2 pounds in the soil. Now, when we look at TRS, a little bit different situation, and this is what we've seen. That foliar shot of boron appears to give us perhaps the better uptake, and results in a higher TRS. And in this case, it was significant compared to the control. We did see some bump in TRS with the soil boron, but it was not significant and certainly not as dramatic. Put it all together, and this is what we found in sugar per acre data. Again, we're picking up somewhere close to 700 pounds of sugar with 1 pound, a half a pound and 1 pound of boron foliar. The best results over 1,000 pounds of sugar was with our 2 pound rate soil applied. So the bottom line, it appears that, if you want to consider boron, if you're testing low in boron, you can certainly put it out. Either way, we have another test that we haven't been able to analyze yet, where we're going to also look at soil applied boron, and we'll update you on that when we get those results. Moving on to starter, we have some long-term experiments where we had 2 varieties planted in an experiment, 299 and 540 plant cane. We've harvested plant cane first and second ratoon. These are our treatments. We've talked about them before. No starter, a starter with no nitrogen, a starter with no phosphorus, starter with no potash, and then the complete material. What we've done here is combine the yields over the whole test. So combined from plant cane through second stubble. And what we found here is we increased cane yield when we averaged across varieties. It was significant with our complete formulation. Looking at the other formulations, we increased it, but it wasn't significant. Sugar per acre, again, we increased it over 1,000 pounds over the cycle. In this case, it wasn't significant at 0.05. But again, we also, the second best treatment would have been the one with nitrogen and phosphorus, but no potash. When we looked at the data, even may not quite be statistically kosher, but we broke the varieties out to look at them more closely. And what was going on here is with 299, we didn't have quite as dramatic effect with the starter fertilizer. I mean, there wasn't a little bit of a benefit with a complete fertilizer, but with 540, we were really seeing a strong effect. And this makes sense. We all know 540 is slow to come out of the ground in the spring, and it appears to be the one that benefits even more from having that starter fertilizer there. And if you look at sugar per acre, again, a significant increase, on the range of 2,000 pounds with a complete fertilizer for 540, or a much lower increase with 299. Another test, the same treatments, just repeating it. This is just combining plant cane and first stubble. In this case, the one without any potash, but with nitrogen and phosphorus, with 540, that appears to be the best treatment, and also with 299. So we're going to harvest this experiment one more year, looking at sugar data. Interestingly enough, with 540, in this case, the treatment without nitrogen gave us the best results, but with 299, and again, it was nitrogen and phosphorus. So maybe this is the place to apply phosphorus, and some of our data are suggesting that. Clearly, we do see some beneficial effects, and it makes sense that, we need phosphorus to establish a good root system, and this may be the time to do it. All right, now for something completely different to end up with here. I got a call from a grower in Maurice, Brian Simone, and he basically told me that, Rich, he says, look, I got some poultry litter and I put it out at planting, and I want you to come look at it and tell me if you think I did a good thing or not. So We went out and took a look at this. Katie and I went out and looked at the field, and he really did a good job putting this out because he actually, he set it up so we could just do an experiment very easily where he alternated rows where he put it and he didn't put it. His rate was at a third of a ton. He was getting it from Texarkana at about $200 a ton, I think was the rate or the cost. And of course, poultry manure would serve as a source of that nitrogen and phosphorus, plus also organic matter. And those soils he has, they're very sandy, highly erodible soils. He needs a source of organic matter. He applied it using a regular dry fertilizer applicator. He just unhooked the hoses so they weren't going down in the coulters, just going right into the opened middle. This fall, we were able to get some stand counts, some heights, some imagery in November, and of course we're going to follow up in the spring with shoot counts, stock counts, and also yield data in 2021. So we did see a difference. This is just showing you what we saw as far as the heights. I mean, we were just going up to the first fully open dewlap, so they were, it was just a few inches tall, but we were able to detect the difference where we had the poultry manure, and we were able to see differences also in the actual population count, significant. So give you an idea of what it looks like. I mean, you can pretty clearly see where he put the manure. I mean, we had the green strips across the field, and it was kind of interesting when you're at ground level, this wasn't really that apparent at all. I mean, when you looked at the difference in height from our stats, it really wasn't that dramatic, but when you get up in the air with a drone, it becomes very obvious. And just some different views of that field. And again, the effect is pretty dramatic. And this is a different field about a mile away where he also did the same thing. But we will be following up on this experiment and finally to end up with, you put it together, you do an NDVI, and it becomes pretty clear there's more biomass in those areas where we had the poultry litter. So that's all I have. I'm going to stop right there. And actually, I'll turn it over. You can either have questions now, I can turn it over to Brenda, and we can have questions at the end. Thanks.